Core systems transferring control to probe craft. Launch when ready.
I'm the Scale Model Geek, and if you haven't guessed by the intro and the title of the video, this video I'm actually building the Colonial Viper from Battlestar Galactica, specifically the 1978 version. This 3D file I got from a man by the name of Alain Rivard, and hopefully I pronounced his name correctly, and I'll leave a link where you can get this particular file in the description. This Viper kit has actually got some really nice detail. Now originally this came in as a 1/24 scale file, but I shrunk it down to 1/32 simply because I'll be building a diorama out of it, and at 1/24, that's a big diorama. My plan is to do a scene inside the hangar bay and specifically on the launch rail. And just like every resin build, there's a bit of preparation to do. In this particular case, because I did shrink the 1/24 scale file down to 1/32, some of the tolerances are a bit tighter, so a bit of sanding needs to be done so the parts kind of fit a little bit better. And the usual filling, sanding, filing, you know the usual. Now Lane has actually a whole bunch of other stuff on his Facebook page. Not only does he have this Viper, but he has a whole bunch of Star Wars stuff, including the Naboo, NX thingy one, the Mandalorian one. That's on his page, and that is a really nice kit, because I have that as well. And if that wasn't special enough, he's currently working on a sandcrawler. Now that looks pretty awesome. I've seen some preview files of that. That is going to be one very big kit by the looks of it. So go check it out. I had so much fun building this Viper that in the future I'm actually going to do the 1/24 scale of that. From what I could tell, the actual kit is quite accurate in detail compared to what I saw in the actual movie. By the way, did I tell you there was a bit of sanding? Now because I had such large flat areas on there, I did end up with some print lines and some divots that I got from my supports. So a bit of filling, and again a bit of wet sanding this time around. That sanding block is a 400 grit. Now off camera I gave all the major parts some undercoat, and I've decided to stay with the colour of the undercoat because it seems to be quite accurate. And some of the black areas already blocked in as well. That's the back of the engines. There's really only two types of glue you can use on resin, and that's either two-part epoxy glue or super glue. I got all enthusiastic about this build that I actually went and started re-watching the original Battlestar Galactica series. I'd forgotten how good it was actually. Hold it, I spoke too soon. Galactica 1980 was rubbish. If you spend a bit of time on preparation, when it comes to actually assembling it, it becomes a lot easier. Now to paint the actual Viper, I decided my research should be focused on how they paint aircraft. And one of the things that aircraft builders do is they pre-shade their aircraft. And I'm using some of this dark sea grey, and I'm just adding some of this darkness around the panel lines. And because I've never built aircraft before, this technique just feels a bit weird to me. And after this stage, it kind of looked really awful. But don't panic, because the next stage actually fixes all this up. Now I'm using the original colour, which was this undercoat, this ghost grey. And I use this colour to give the whole kit a really soft, light coat of paint. And that just covers the heaviness of that dark sea grey. Now I did do some modifications to the kit as well. Now in some references I did see the kit as having some turbines in the actual engines. And after a bit of scouting on Thingiverse, I found a couple of different files which I combined in Blender to create these custom turbines. My first print didn't have a backing to it, and it just kind of fell apart. So I had to go in there and modify and add a backing to it. And that just kind of strengthened the whole turbine fan as well. Now this whole thing is just made up of a whole bunch of basic shapes. And as I break it down, you can see they're just really simple things. And this very bit, the backing, is what basically kept it nice and strong. And you can see the difference between the two. And then it just popped into place. Now I need to paint the insides of those intakes black. So I'm starting off just painting the edges with some liquid latex. And then running some masking tape around the edges and covering the whole engine. That way I can just airbrush it and get a nice even flat finish. And that's just Vallejo black. Now to dry brush some of the metallic areas, some of this gun metal. These are the little modules that are on the side of the fuselage. And those turbines again. You can see it really popping the detail out. And just to add a bit of visual interest, some of this light metal from ammo, and I'm just going to dry brush just some of the highlights around the different metallic areas. As an experiment, I decided to use some of this Celestial Azure from Green Stuff World and give it that kind of, burnt metallic look to the exhaust. And the insides of the engine, some of this gold. Just to make it a bit different. Something interesting. And one more technique that aircraft modelers use. I'm using some of this white grey and I'm creating a really soft mottled finish to the actual fuselage. And the wings. It's hard to see this in the video, but it actually looks really good live. Now off camera, what I did do, I gave the engines a bit of a light spray of this hairspray. I decanted it into my airbrush, and where I'm putting the striping, I gave it that coat of the hairspray. And this is effectively going to help me with the chipping effect. As much as I like the final results from masking, I'm not really a fan of the process. For the striping colour, I'm using some of this orange fire. Now I'm doing these in really light coats, and in between the coats I'm just using a hairdryer to, dry them off. I wasn't kind of liking the colour, it just felt a bit too yellow for me. So I ended up using some of this red and gave it a really light mist over it, and I ended up with a really nice orangey colour to it. And surprise, surprise, I ended up some really nice sharp lines from the masking. As much as I dislike it, as I said, it was worth it. Now onto the chipping of these lines. What I'm doing is I have a wet brush there and I'm dabbing some of the areas that I want to chip with some water. And that softens the hairspray, and then the paint really just chips off. Hence why it's called chipping. The more water you put on, the bigger chips you get. Now back onto the dark sea grey, and I'm using this for the nose of the actual fuselage. And you can see some more masking. I then added a few drops of white to the dark sea grey and painted the stripes on the engines, because they're actually a lighter shade of the grey. So far so good, really happy with the progress of this Viper so far. With the painting all done, I've superglued the turbines into the engine intakes. And of course I can assemble the rest of the engines as well. I was also very happy with the metallic tones that I got in the engines. A lot of the things that I came across when I was doing some research into the Viper was how many variations there are. The Mobius kit looks very different to the Revell kit, and even the model that they used for the actual filming in the original TV series is different to the life-size build that they used on set. Fun fact, in the original filming models they actually used fighter pilots and not Viper pilots, so they've got white helmets and the goggles, you know, like jet pilots. I guess they figured no one would ever notice, but we did. With all the parts being glued together, it's turning out to be quite a heavy little Viper, even at 1/32nd scale. Now this little section here, I end up regretting gluing in a little bit later on. Stick around, you'll see why. With all the major parts glued together, it really looks impressive now. And for the first time, I'm actually using this panel line accent colour, dark grey, for, get ready to this, panel lines. I usually use it for other areas. I normally use black when I want to highlight areas, but this time around, because of the vehicle being so light, I needed to go with the dark grey. Or else it'll be just way too heavy. There it is, the paint job's about 90% finished. Maybe 95. This is the cockpit tub that you get with the actual files. It's got some really nice detail. And the figure you get with it, wasn't a huge fan of it, because I kind of wasn't, like I said, not a fan of the pose. And I kind of might have printed him a little bit too big, didn't adjust him properly. And to solve my pilot dilemma, I actually jumped onto a website called Titancraft, where you can design your own figures. And what you do on this side is you select a base figure, then you modify him. In this particular case, I moved him and reposed him into a sitting position, so it kind of looks like he's holding the joystick, as well as giving a thumbs up to his crew. Now, basically you just pick a whole bunch of different boots and garments and that type of thing, and I tried to find it as close as I could to a Viper pilot. And just by moving his arms and legs, and you can get the exact pose that you desire. And once you've got what you wanted, it's just a matter of downloading the 3D file, which is only about $2 or $3, and printing it out. And this is what I ended up with. I did do some more modifications in Blender to chop his legs off, so I can fit him into the cockpit. But to make him fit in the cockpit like this, he kind of came out a bit small. The pilot just doesn't look right inside that tub. My next thought was maybe I should just model the pilot inside the tub within a software called Blender. And this is what I ended up with. It was a perfect size, but then I realised, how am I going to paint him? There's no way I'm going to get in there properly to give him a good paint job. So my next option was to separate him from the cockpit. So my next attempt involved him sitting on the chair, holding his joystick and just sliding him into the cockpit. But holy moly, the controls wouldn't allow that. Now, because of all the dials, I just couldn't slide him in properly. Another little disaster. Didn't think that out too well. So I figured what I need to do is completely separate everything apart. And this was the final result. This is the original cockpit tub, and you can see the detail in there is wonderful. So from this process, I sliced down the tub into sections. I started off with the base, and then added the seat, and a little box there for the pilot to sit on. And there's the pilot. I then added the joystick, and my side walls, the back and the front. Now, having that in 3 pieces, because the pilot was actually connected up to the seat and the base, I was able to print this in 3 sections, giving me complete access. And to make sure I got my sizes correct, I used this reference photo of Apollo sitting in his Viper, and in hindsight I probably could have just done this in 2 prints. Had the figure connected to the back, and then the sidewalls as another print. Even though this took a bit of time to sort out, I actually had a lot of fun doing it. I really enjoyed problem solving that one, and the good news is when I do my 1/24th scale version, I've got it all ready to go. And look at that, 3 pieces, my painting issue is solved. And talking about painting, flat black for the inside of the cockpit. And to dry brush, I'm using some of the ammo gunmetal. Now to paint the figure, burnt red for his jacket. Now I did find some really nice reference. This is Starbuck. He's a cool dude in the series. And for his pants, some of this brown sand. And his shirt. Now I've just used those base colours, added a bit of white for the dry brushing. And for his buckles on his jacket, I'm using some of this steel. And yes, that is incorrect, it's supposed to be gold. And for his flesh tones, I'm using some of this sand ivory and beige red. And I'm just mixing a combination with some white as well. And for the shading area, some of this burnt red with some glazed medium. I'm just varying some of the shades like I said, and adding my shadows and my highlights. And there he is. Baldy all done. And finally some super glue to put all the 3 pieces together, and it did need a bit of sanding to get those joints perfect. And I just needed to paint the top section of that in black, didn't have to do the whole tub. I've got to say it was so satisfying to sort that one out. And 5-minute epoxy resin to glue him into place. I painted his helmet off camera, and it's something I'll stick on a little bit later. Just test fitting here. Now I found this launch rail for my diorama on Thingiverse. Unfortunately it was so big there was no way I could actually print it. So I ended up modifying the file into one small section and then repainting it 3 times to give it the right length that I needed. There's actually quite a lot of resin printing in this diorama. Now I'll also modify the file so I can have an end cap to it. And technically I can have this as long as I want, and I just stop it off with those end caps. In this project all I need is 3. Even with 3 it's about 500mm long. Subglue to hold it all into place. This section here you really want to get it as accurate as possible because you want to try and avoid as much sanding as possible. The center launch rail also needed to be printed in 3 sections for the length, but luckily all 3 pieces fitted on the one plate of the resin printer. Again, I took my time gluing these pieces together, and this gave me a minimal amount of sanding to do. Sorry about the shaky cam. I was trying to do a Jason Bourne movie. Not. Now this section I probably should have glued after I painted it, but I didn't. Then a quick even coat of this Rust-Oleum primer, and then a bit of dry brushing with this gunmetal from Ammo. If you haven't already, I'd love it if you smash that like button, hit the subscribe, and also share the video. Your support will be greatly appreciated. And this is what happens when you don't think through a few things. Had to mask it all up just so I can paint the center rail black. It would have been far less work if I just simply painted it black before I actually glued it onto the base. It is what it is. Anyway, after the black coat, I gave a bit of a dry brush with this light metal from Ammo. Even though it was looking pretty good here, I kind of felt it needed a bit more weathering. So after a bit of thinking, I decided I'm going to add some of this oil wash from Soilworks. I'm just going to run it down the side of the rail. And it was during this process I was actually thinking about the cockpit of my Viper, and I decided, you know what, I kind of want to have it open up, because originally the plan was to keep it closed, but you lose a lot of the detail there. So to actually have it open up, which meant I needed to modify the files. So it was back into Blender again, and I imported the original files and started modifying them. I downloaded this piston from Thingiverse and modified it, and then added the huge lever system onto the back of that cockpit. And that I'll print up in two separate pieces. So the piston will actually be part of that cockpit. And this is what it looks like all printed up. Really happy with that. But then I realised my next problem is I have to remove the old back of that cockpit. Now I'm just putting some electrical tape there to protect the paintwork so I don't actually chip at it. Now I was very nervous at this section. Wasn't sure what was going to happen, but luckily it actually just popped off. That was so simple, but I couldn't get it out. Because of the back of the seat, the headrest, I couldn't get it past the pilot. So my only solution was to actually break that seat. And luckily, because it's resin, it's very brittle, so it just snapped off in a clean line, which means when I glue it back on, it's going to come up really nice. And that new piece just slid straight in. Didn't have to do any sanding, any filing, didn't have to do anything, it just popped right in. Now to add some of the window panes to the cockpit, I'm using some of this clear from Evergreen, and it's 0.13 millimeters. Now to get the right shapes, I just used the old cockpit. Is that a cockpit or windscreen? I don't know what it is, whatever it is. I used that to draw the shapes that I needed so I can cut out the clear sections. And when I cut out the clear sections, I made sure that I had a couple millimeters on each side. And I need those couple extra millimeters so my windows don't fall through the hole. That would be awkward. And to glue those windows in, I actually used a bit of PVA glue. And the reason I use that is because PVA actually dries clear. And now let's assemble all that work. Now for the actual windscreen, I only had one go at it. If I didn't get it right in there the first time, I was going to have a problem. Ta-da! Worked first go. Yeah, I should have put the seat in before I put in the windscreen. Look at that, so happy I did that. It was well worth the effort. Now back onto the rest of the diorama. I found this awesome maintenance platform on Thingiverse, which I downloaded and then printed it up. But, oh my god, I had a disaster. The actual 3D file was so fine in detail that when I actually tried to pull it off the supports, the whole thing just fell apart. I mean, you can see how many supports I used just to stop it from warping, but it was just way too many and there was no way I could reduce the amount of supports there. So again, I've ended up having to do some more modifications. The only way I thought I could fix this was to bring in the file into Blender once again and modify the original file. And this is what it looks like, and effectively what I did was I actually doubled the strength of all the supports in there. And you can see straight away how thick everything is. I increased the base so it's a lot thicker, and every step had a thicker platform as well. I increased it by about 50% in thickness. And these are the paths that I actually added. Now I've just hidden the original file, and this is what I created. But the good news is that work again was worth it, because once I kind of got sick of this little thing and threw it out, I ended up with this little beauty. Look how good that came up. I've already undercoated it off camera. And no warping, the thing is strong as. Not a problem. Again, the good news, it's a 3D file, so I can use it and print it multiple times now for other projects. I can even use it for an aircraft project if I need to. Normally a hangar bay would be absolutely spotless, all the equipment well maintained, but I took a bit of creative license and just added a bit of visual interest to it. So I decided to paint that platform with this wash. And for the launch rail, I actually needed a back end to it, and I couldn't find anything that was accurate. The ones were woefully just horrible, and I ended up creating this from scratch. So I jumped into Blender. I used a whole bunch of references from the TV show to find it as accurate as I possibly can, and it's about 95% accurate. I did have to do some modifications simply to allow for the printing process, and there it is, undercoated and weathered, and then super glued into place. And now onto the final touch for the Viper. I'm just adding some of these weathering streaks, and I'm just using some pastel chalk which I ground down onto a piece of sandpaper, and just using a soft brush and just running across the body. And then another bushier brush there, as you can see in the background, to soften some of the edges. And these gave me some really nice realistic streaks. And that's the Viper all done. So now it's on to the rest of the diorama and assembling all the different components. I'm just using some 5-minute epoxy resin here, made by Sally's. It's called Araldite. And because I've got 5 minutes, I can place it down onto the launch ramp and adjust it until it solidifies. Now off camera, I cut up some XPS foam for my base. Now I've already coated it with some undercoat. Here I'm just using some creative license. I'm just masking up an area so I can paint some safety lines or hazard lines. Now in the original TV series there isn't any of those anywhere on the floor, but I want to kind of break it up a bit because everything is grey. I'm using this flat yellow from Vallejo, and I'm actually brushing across the tape. So I'm going from the tape to the actual base. That way I shouldn't get any runs underneath. And hopefully I'll end up with some really crisp lines. Now I did end up needing to do a couple of coats of this yellow. I then cut up some small strips and stuck them on diagonally, and the areas that are actually exposed will be painted black. And lucky for me, I did end up with some really sharp lines. I'm not really fussed if it's not 100% accurate to a TV show. For me, as long as the final result is interesting. And I'm really happy with the way this diorama has been coming together. Now I'm using this orange fire to paint a couple of figures that I created in Titancraft, and this is my ground crew. And yeah, I decided to print them all as females. Don't know why, but I did. And effectively I used the same techniques as I did for the pilot. And a bit of super glue into place, and I decided not to go with that walking figure. But right here, I was kind of looking at it and I was thinking, it's missing something. It really needs something else. I figured this Viper might be in the launch bay for some testing or some maintenance, so it kind of needs a couple diagnostic computers. So I jumped into Blender once again, created these computer terminals onto some stands. Now the actual top of the computers I did find online, and then stuck them to the custom bases. Once again I'm using the panel line accent colors to bring out some of that detail, Now when I was looking for a computer, I was trying to find actually a retro looking computer, because the series originally was made in 1978, so kind of a future retro look to it. And once all the accent colours had dried up, I used some of this ammo light sand to dry brush the actual computers, and that gave it that beigey complexion, even though the computers on the Galactica are actually grey. There's the final result. Looks great, but look, you know what? It needs something on the screen. I found a couple of images that would suit my purposes online, and then laser printed them onto a sheet of paper, cut them out, and just using a bit of PVA glue, I glued the little images into the screens. And for a final touch on the screens, I used some clear UV resin with a torch, of course a UV torch, to harden it all up. Those two terminals actually came up really well, and I'll be just using a bit of PVA glue to glue them to the base. I had just finished editing this video and doing the voiceover when I received a message from Elaine. He'd informed me he actually did some updates to the Viper kit, and the updates are truly amazing. Check this out. The addition of that launch pad just takes the Viper to a brand new level. Just have a look at the detail, absolutely amazing. What's even more impressive, the whole thing is in 1/24th scale, so this is a really huge build. And some more great news is that if you purchase the Viper, you actually get this launch pad for free with it. If you already have purchased a Viper, guess what? It'll automatically appear in your original link folder. How good is that? The only way to beat that is to throw in a free set of steak knives. After all that, let's go check out the hero images from my build.